Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, fellow organizers, all guests here in this Constitution Hall as we are assembled in, and also all you on stream at the moment. It is a great honor to welcome you and also be the host of this day one under this conference, Museums Under Pressure, organized by the Federation of the International Human Rights Museums. We are going to have interesting talks, panels, discussing very important issues. But let me first say that it's a great honor not only to be having you visit Eidsvoll, but indeed this Constitution Hall, because this hall was the very place where the Norwegian Constitution was put forward, deliberated, voted for, and also signed in those 6 weeks in April and May of 1814. So you are on historical grounds indeed, in a Norwegian context at least. It will, as you might know, the result of this deliberation process was one of the most radical constitution of its time in 1814, with a great focus on the people's sovereignty based in the constitution, with a high proportion of voters, and also much power led to the legislative body, as we today know as Stortinget. So that's both the radical part, and it's also, might say it was a sustainable constitution, as it is still in function, of course with its amendments, but still. Our museum, my name is Bård Frydenlund, by the way. I'm the director, the CEO of this museum. And as a museum of we call ourselves the Constitutional Museum of Norway. We have, of course, the large obligation of being the manager of this cultural heritage, our national monument, Eidsvollbygningen, as we call it in Norwegian, as well as convey the history of the establishment of the Norwegian Constitution and the history from 1814 and the development of political history from that year. But also, as the part 3 is also to promote what we can call at least youth citizenship, promote an active role and active participation among youth, but also the understanding of human rights as part of the whole political system of Norway. And of course, we are honored to be also hosting as the coordinating museum for the Norwegian National Museum Network for Democracy and Human Rights. It's so a long word, so I have to use my script to get it right. And of course, in a historical perspective, the human rights has also always been part of the Norwegian Constitution, but was also on more contemporary terms made actual in the bicentennial year of the Constitution in 2014, when we also got a human rights catalogue in the Norwegian Constitution. So I really look forward to taking part and listening into the panels, the talks, and all of your contributions this 3 days. And it is an important issue, of course. We live in uncertain times, indeed. The pressure that many museums are living under is getting harder. We in Norway has nothing to complain about, of course, but there are other parts in the world that have more problems than we. But it is important to still strengthen our ability to address topics, to dare to still not to provoke for the provocation, but provoke to make authorities and ourselves as museum staff what we are doing, what we are transmitting to an audience, and how we use our cultural heritage sites in a societal duty. So I will then, it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Torleif Hamre, the head coordinator for this session. So please, Torleif, the floor is yours.
A heartily welcome to everyone to the FIHRM Oslo 2022 conference. Museums under pressure, government, community, autonomy. This is a great day for our Norwegian network of museums for democracy and human rights, indeed. We are so excited to meet all of you, all you dedicated workers in this field from several countries. Of course, it is an honor for the three hosting institutions, that is Eidsvoll 1814, where we are now, the Nobel Peace Center, and the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies, to all be able to welcome you and meet with you today and for 2 more days to come. Museums under pressure. The title indicates that our museums face serious challenges in our times. The rise of authoritarianism, of extremism and polarization, the consequences of the pandemic and of economic crisis, and not least, a war in our midst in Europe. All of this poses serious threats in some instances, and to everyone, challenges in our operating amidst all kinds of pressures and interests. Working between government and community, our public, and trying to set our own agenda amidst all of this. All of this will be discussed throughout the conference, these challenges and threats and tendencies we see. However, a FIHRM conference is always also about hope and inspiration and sharing experiences, sharing all the good work that museum workers are carrying out throughout the world, and also the work carried out by communities and ordinary citizens who value and use and take part in the museums in their midst. Today at Eidsvoll, we will address the broad themes of the conference into opening keynotes in the next session, as well as some particular challenges with a view to the future presented in a panel from FIHRM's mother institution in Liverpool. That is to come in the next sessions today. Tomorrow, we will meet with Director Kjersti Fløgstad and her colleagues at the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo Center. We will continue to explore in depth the main theme of museums operating between all those interests and the different pressures felt. And we will pay particular attention to some topics close to the heart of the Nobel Peace Center. That is, museums in war and peace. You might say, museums in the crossfire in a real sense, including an urgent appeal from Ukraine. On our last day, on Wednesday, we will go to the Museum Peninsula of Bygdøy, to the Norwegian Holocaust Center, to meet with Guri Hjeltnes and her staff, and they will have prepared a fine program where with a succession of thought-provoking case presentations and also a particular attention to the topic of minority representation in our museums there at Bygdøy. This is the main program that you may follow, of course, live, you who are here today, and also online our followers online. And then there are certain activities in between, workshops, excursions, etc. Now, we have the pleasure to welcome the president of the Federation of International Human Rights Museums, Guillermo Upey, from Argentina, from Rosario, Argentina, who is president of FIHRM since 2021. Guillermo is a social entrepreneur who has put his energies and his resources to work for human rights and democracy and democratic values, and also in particular the struggle against modern slavery, first in his own homeland, Argentina, through the Foundation for International Democracy and the Democracy Museum in Rosario, through the Latin American network of FIHRM, and also through wide networks internationally. Mr. Upey, it's a great pleasure. The floor is yours, and Guillermo will be translated by Marina Sala.
Estimados amigos, buenas tardes. Es un honor para mí encontrarnos en la reunión anual de FIHRM.
Dear friends, good evening. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to this annual FIHRM conference.
Agradecer siempre a los organizadores, a Thorleif, también a todos aquellos que pensaron que lo nuestro es suficientemente importante para estar aquí, a David, mi amigo y mi mentor.
Thank you to the organizers, to Norway, to Thorleif, and also to David, my friend and mentor, and all who were who thought this and who think and thought that what we do is important enough, is motive enough for us to be here today.
Me gusta insistir con un concepto. Todos los museos deben o pueden ser de derechos humanos.
I like to insist with this firm motto: every museum can and should be a human rights museum.
Los museos estamos llamados a hacer una revolución en el mundo.
Museums are called to make a revolution in the world.
Somos los únicos, junto con las universidades y las bibliotecas, donde el mayor de los dictadores habla en voz baja.
We are the only spaces among universities and libraries where the worst dictator speaks low out of respect.
Nuestra forma de comunicarnos es a través del arte, pero siempre, como dice David, tomando partido.
Our way to communicate is through art, but as David usually says, always taking a stand.
La pobreza, esa pandemia que mata 1 millón de niños anuales en América Latina por hambre.
Poverty, that pandemic that takes 1 million children's lives in Latin America per year by hunger or related diseases.
Más de 3.000 millones de personas todas las noches se acuestan con hambre.
More than 3,000 million people go to bed every night with hunger.
50 millones de esclavos en el mundo.
50 million slaves in the world.
160 millones de niños hacen trabajo infantil.
160 million children work.
Y Qatar, donde se va a realizar dentro de 50 días el próximo Mundial de Fútbol.
And Qatar, where the next World Cup will take place in 50 days.
Ya lleva 7.000 muertos. 7.000 muertos en la construcción de la infraestructura del Mundial de Fútbol.
It has taken more than 7,000 lives in the construction for the infrastructure for the World Cup.
7.000 personas que a nadie le importa, ni a la FIFA, ni al fútbol, es el Mundial de la Vergüenza.
7,000 people, and nobody cares about them, nor FIFA, nor the countries, nor football. It's the World Cup of shame.
Esto es tomar partido. Hablar de temas prohibidos, peligrosos, incómodos.
This is taking a stand to talk about forbidden issues, dangerous and uncomfortable.
Nosotros debemos demostrar en los museos de derechos humanos que sí nos importan.
We must show that we do care.
Debemos contarle al mundo estos flagelos,
We must tell the world about these issues,
juntos, unidos, detrás de una causa común.
together, united, behind the common cause.
El sueño, el hermoso sueño de un mundo justo para toda la humanidad.
The beautiful dream of a fair world for all mankind.
Muchas gracias. Vamos al lado de Oslo. Acá.
Thank you so much, Guillermo, for a strong message to us all. And now we're going to listen to another strong message from a colleague, a museum colleague, that could not come here today, but he will be present. We're talking about Lonnie G. Bunch III, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, which is perhaps the largest museum or organization in the world, and also co-founder of FIHRM in its time. And he has worked with several museums, among others with the American African History Museum, and will draw examples from his vast experience. And Lonnie Bunch, he stresses that in times like these of COVID, war, and social and political strife, museums, well, they are really under pressure, but they also have a vital role to play and may give hope. That is the central message. So we are now going to watch on the screen Lonnie G. Bunch III.
Hello. I'm honored and humbled to speak to you today. The Federation of International Human Rights Museums and its member organizations are doing such important work. In many ways, you embody what I consider two of the museum's underappreciated strengths: the ability to address inequities in society and the power to tell the unvarnished truth. Human rights are fundamentally about getting people to look beyond our superficial differences and appreciate our shared humanity. The past few years have proven that we need institutions that support human rights more than ever. Nations have had to grapple with, to one degree or another, with the emotional and economic burdens of COVID, of war, of political and social strife. Museums have endured these in a variety of ways. It's been a difficult time for all of us, but I see it as a learning moment, as an opportunity of change. I believe that not only do we have the ability to adapt to these challenges of profession, we've shown why we're ideally suited to help our world, our nations, and our communities survive and thrive. We can give people the resources to understand themselves and each other. We can inspire wonder and answer questions about the natural world. We can contextualize the past to inform today and envision tomorrow. In short, we can define reality and give hope. We can and we must, because our shared future as a species depends upon it. I wish I could be with you in Oslo. I love Oslo. I always look forward to visiting international museums and meeting my colleagues around the world and seeing how approaches and ideas differ. Those visits have been some of the most important experiences that have shaped my thinking about museums and the potential for museums to have a positive impact. For instance, my work has long been inspired by South Africa's efforts at dismantling apartheid. The revolution there reinforced my belief that history can transform a country and that museums have a vital role to play in healing and reconciliation. Several of that country's cultural institutions have been instrumental in decolonizing the narrative and correcting the historical record. I also think of how courageous acts by a single museum can inspire others to be bolder in tackling difficult subjects. In the 1990s, the Merseyside Maritime Museum in Liverpool, England, put on an exhibition examining how the city had been at the center of the international transatlantic slave trade. I remember coming to Liverpool in 1999 to give the talk on the first Slavery Remembrance Day. There was still a great deal of controversy surrounding it. In fact, the Lord Mayor said, quote, that too much focus on the past is not good for a community. But the honest conversation turned out to be a blessing, not just for the city of Liverpool, but for the United Kingdom. Not only did the museum reach the Black population of Liverpool in a profound new way, it also generated a wider conversation about Black people's important historical contributions to the UK. A few years afterwards, many other British cultural mainstays, from the National Gallery to the Museum of the City of London, joined in celebrating, or at least commemorating, the bicentennial of the slave trade's abolition in the UK. The success of the original exhibitions led to the development of the International Slavery Museum. I fervently believe that we must reckon with our past if we are to proceed forward. We must examine even the dark corners of our history, no matter how uncomfortable. That applies to cultural institutions as well, especially when it comes to the ethical concerns of objects in our collections. This is a moment of self-reflection for museums. When we consider the objects in our collections, we must think about our ethical and moral obligations as well as our scholarly and preservation. As the United States National Museum, Education and Research Complex, the Smithsonian seeks to set a standard for ethical collections practices. Traditionally, museums focused on the legality of ownership, not on what effect on the community of the origins and its cultural heritage were. Today, the museum field is recognizing that the origin community's wishes must be accounted for. Ultimately, a museum is not the sole interpreter of cultural artifacts as collections. That's why the Smithsonian adopted a formal policy for shared stewardship with communities represented in our collections. We will consider the return of collections, when appropriate, based on ethical considerations, such as how the objects were originally acquired. It's just another way in which cultural institutions must adapt to the needs of multiple communities. It entails acting ethically and socially responsibly in everything we do. In other words, we should set the moral standard. When I think of community, I'm always reminded of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The stark choice he laid out in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, is as relevant today as it was in 1967. He wrote, quote, "Are we more concerned with the size of power and wealth in our society or with creating a more just society? The failure to pursue justice is not only a moral default. Without it, social tensions will grow, the turbulence in the streets will persist despite disapproval or repressive action." That expansive view of community tied to justice is not limited to a neighborhood or a group of people sharing similar characteristics. It is a greater connection, one of shared humanity. That notion of community should be a driving force in our decision-making as cultural institutions. As a profession, we're beginning to recognize and take ownership of the power we have to foster community. We can and must use the vast resources at our disposal, history, art, collections, research, education, to equip the public with tools they need in a productive and meaningful way. One example is the genealogical resource available to the public at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. The Freedmen's Bureau Transcription Project is the largest crowdsourced initiative at the Smithsonian. The Freedmen's Bureau was an effort by the War Department to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom between 1865 and 1872 after the American Civil War. It is a vital tool for African Americans and for all Southerners interested in tracing their roots. Records were often haphazard and incomplete, and sadly, many of the enslaved weren't given the names by their oppressors, just numbers. The Transcription Project has enlisted more than 20,000 volunteers to transcribe over 200,000 more of the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, and so that the public can have access to those records from their computers. Several American universities have participated in the project and used it in the classrooms. Museums also have the capability, and I'd argue the responsibility, to bring people together who haven't always been part of the conversation. For example, we created something called our Shared Future, Reckoning with Our Racial Past. It's the first coordinated Smithsonian effort to explicitly address racism and racial equity. It explores how Americans confront race, the legacy of racial discrimination is left on communities, and how issues of race will shape our nation's future. The project has begun to explore and expand the conversation about the historic roots of contemporary movements in social justice. It is also encouraging dialogue about race and providing live and digital resources and experiences to local communities throughout the country. We are also reaching out to communities often overlooked in the national conversation with our upcoming rural initiative. By exploring current, relevant issues in rural America, we can provide resources and tools to help them build resilience, and we can expand our programming and services to identify, to listen to, and to collaborate with rural stakeholders to meet the needs of rural and tribal communities in the United States. Throughout this initiative, the Smithsonian will provide space for dialogue, prioritize diversity, identify and root out bias in our collections and programs, and work with organizations around the country. To build community means listening to what people need, meeting them where they are, and providing help that goes beyond what is typically expected of museums. In other words, how are we of value, not just based on what we once did, but what we can do today? I'm especially proud of the work that the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum has done to combat hunger. The museum has worked with Feed the Fridge, a program that places stocked refrigerators that offer free food in areas with high level of food insecurity. The refrigerator in the Anacostia Museum's parking lot has provided 500 free meals a week since January 2021 and will operate throughout this year. The Anacostia's exhibition, Food for the People, goes hand in hand with that effort, detailing food insecurity in the Washington, D.C. metro area and explaining the reasons behind it. It's the kind of coordinated community support that museums are best equipped for by combining immediate help for those in need with an education that can help a community long term. We can be not just what the people want, but what they need. One of the most powerful examples of transcendent museum community building took place when I was director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The museum evokes so many strong reactions. I've lost count of the number of times people were visibly moved there, including myself. One of the most emotional exhibits is the casket of Emmett Till, a young man whose racist murder in 1955 inspired so many leaders of the civil rights movement. I came to know his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, when I got her blessings to tell her son's story in the museums. She told me that she expected us to carry the burden of history and the weight of memory, no matter how painful. By entrusting us with her son's memory, she gave the museum one of its most powerful opportunities to help visitors learn, heal, and grow together. Soon after the museum opened, I witnessed that potential in action. As often the case, a young Black woman was overcome with emotion as she took in this powerful display of somebody so young who was killed so senselessly. The evil of racism embodied in that box, that casket, meant to show the world what had happened An older white man approached and asked if he could cry with her. After a moment, she agreed. They locked arms, tears flowing in silent anguish for the unthinkable murder of a child decades before. That's the power and promise of museums. When they're at their best, they bring people together. They are scrupulously honest, but hopeful, and they work for the common good. I thank you all for working to bring something into the world that enriches communities, inspires people to embrace their shared humanity. You make me optimistic for our shared future. You help me believe that our job really is to define reality, no matter how painful, and give hope. Thank you so much for all that you do.
To bring people together, to foster community, and such strong cases in favor of this strong message. We are now going to meet another veteran in the progressive museum movement, so to say, David Fleming, who founded the Federation of International Human Rights Museums in 2010 from Liverpool, who was director of National Museums Liverpool from 2001 to 2017, and who has served in leading positions in several international human rights organizations. And I dare say, I think many of us must agree, David has been both inspirator, mentor, and even midwife for many of us and for many of our projects. In several regions of the world, David Fleming has been operating. David Fleming is currently, he was also a professor in public history at Liverpool Hope University. He's now retired, but I think he's the kind of people who never really retires. And David, are you still a rebel with the cause? Please share your reflections with us.
Well, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak in this hallowed hall, because it's very important worldwide, Norwegian independence. And I'm grateful to Torleif for those kind words as well. So human rights, what do we mean by human rights? I find myself constantly looking back at the United Nations Declaration in the 1940s now. So it's quite old, the Declaration of Human Rights, in order to explain what we mean by it. And the role of museums, as Lonnie has said, and Guillermo said earlier, is an important one in promoting the whole issue of human rights. In the USA, for example, we have racism still rampant, and it's constant in many countries around the world, including my own, the UK, where amid this week's, from yesterday's newspaper, there's a story about the racism in the Metropolitan Police, the shooting to death of a young black man called Chris Kaba. Corbyn joins protest against inherently racist police after rapper shooting, reads the headline, amid you know whose death. There was room for this. So wherever you are in the world, I think there's need for dialogue, there's a need for museums to stand up and be counted, to explain the iniquities of the attacks on human rights that are global, but which are different in nature. For example, in Norway and Sweden, places that we think in the UK are, you know, okay, they're good guys in Norway and Sweden. But gun-toting gangs in small-town Sweden push voters to the right, it says here, from yesterday's Sunday Times. Also made room for, although you'll notice that the badly ripped bottoms of the pages, I've ripped it again. Wherever you are, museums have a role to play, is the point of this. Even in those nations where, like Norway, we think in the UK of Norway in three senses. We remember the Vikings, of course. We think of oil, and we think of Anders Breivik. This is the story of modern Norway to us in the UK. Breivik is probably the least well-remembered, you'll be pleased to know. But he remains an example of where things can go wrong when we lurch to the right. The EU generally is against immigration. The gun-toting in Sweden is blamed on immigrants, largely young males. Breivik, I think, was motivated by immigration. In the UK, it's rampant, but so is class warfare in the UK. And the latest education statistics show a growing imbalance between rich and poor in educational terms in the UK. In Argentina, politics is a feature of Argentine history. Never goes away. Santa Fe, I understand, is an island of social democracy, if I can call it that, surrounded by right-wing Argentinians, and Rosario is the capital of Santa Fe, the state of Santa Fe. So I'm grateful to our friends from Rosario who've moved. They're there, they were there, they're over there now, for their work in representing democracy in a nation which is not used to it. In the Arab states, we have gender and sexuality as major issues. These are only major issues. And I noted that a few years ago, 5 years ago, in Winnipeg, I gave an address entitled New Challenges for Human Rights Museums, much of which still rings true today. There are human rights crises all over the world, on every continent, I said then. Notably, journalists who are natural allies of museums in ensuring that stories are told, are being hounded, censored and jailed. We've, of course, seen the murder of Khashoggi since then by the Qataris, by the Saudi Arabians, not the Qataris. Goodness me. But Qatar is the home of the World Cup coming up soon. And as Guillermo said, it's an outrage, really, that the World Cup is being held in a nation that is infamous for its poor treatment, particularly of workers from the Indian subcontinent. Outrageous. And I think that the work that Guillermo and his colleagues are doing in Argentina against Qatar is to be applauded. In Eastern Europe, there is the emergence of anti-migrant right-wing militias in the Czech Republic and Slovenia, I said 5 years ago. In Saudi Arabia, Shia activists are being persecuted. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are attacking non-combatants in Yemen. In Russia, police are crushing peaceful protests with thousands of arrests. This is 5 years ago. Migrants are being held in EU-sponsored camps in Greece. In Nepal, students with disabilities are being segregated. In Bangladesh, a photographer has been denied bail after criticising the government. a new Digital Security Act will silence critics. In Hungary, judicial independence is being undermined, civil society is under attack, media diversity is being eroded. Spain is said to be holding prisoner Catalan activists and politicians. There is discrimination against indigenous peoples and First Nations in many countries, such as Australia, New Zealand and Canada. The list of allegations is almost endless, and that's before we come to Donald Trump and what he did with the USA. And I am very fond of reminding people that 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. He's not alone. You may think he's crazy, you may think he's mad, but 70 million people voted for him in USA. There are big problems there, big problems that Lonnie has referred to. There have been attacks on journalists in Myanmar where well-known inquiry Sai who have been jailed for 7 years each for exposing the execution of the persecuted Rohingya. In Xinjiang in China, Human Rights Watch describes a mass systemic campaign of human rights violations against Turkic Muslims. The reported problems in Nepal and Mauritania, sexual violence, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Venezuela. Meanwhile, satellites are being used to track human rights abuses from space as military-grade satellite technology becomes commercialized to predict crop yield and fire risks. They've shown the destruction of Rohingya villages in Myanmar, prison camps in North Korea, mass graves in Burundi and Iraq, forced relocations in Democratic Republic of Congo, Boko Haram attacks in Nigeria. So governments in the USA, UK, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, the so-called Western democracies, have warned technology firms that they will demand lawful access to all encrypted emails, text messages and voice communications, threatening to compel compliance. At the core of this dispute is whether Apple, Facebook, Google and others should be compelled to provide a backdoor to their product, allowing government investigators to gain access to all communications. The pretext for these actions is, of course, national security, a pretext that was used by the, no need to remind you, by the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s. And this is what happens when national security begins to become the leitmotif, the guiding light of all actions. It's difficult to argue against national security, but it's easy to abuse, I think, is the message there. So, I think that the role of FIHRM is to ensure that there is dialogue between these nations. There's a global problem of human rights abuse, which is different in different nations, and it's different in China, for example, from what it is in the USA, where we do have, or they have, largely freedom of the press. Largely. You don't expect a knock on the door in the night in the UK, but it could happen in some countries around the world. And it's important that museums understand this, that museums and politics are very much tied together, even although, according to some people, politics has no role in museums. I think it's the leitmotif, it is the guiding light of all museums, or should be, that they are involved in politics. I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an example of the abuse of power that museums must confront and challenge. But I also think that access to water, culture, climate, disability, and the Nobel Peace Prize, which museums in war and peace, we will learn all about this during the course of this conference, I expect. With democracy in all this. Democracy is a fragile creature that museums must defend, and it's easy to be abused. It's easy for democracy to go wrong. 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, for example, you know, in the USA. And 70 million people is an awful lot of votes. He's not alone in thinking the way he does. The pandemic of COVID has accelerated the attacks on human rights around the world. but I do share the view that museums can give hope and inspiration to people, that they, as long as they take their job seriously. Lonnie said that museums are ideally suited to challenge, to contextualize the past and to give hope. For example, he gave an example of museums in South Africa and what they have done as part of the peace and reconciliation there. In Liverpool, the International Slavery Museum reckons with the past. I'm about to stop. Especially equipping the public with tools. Sorry, I'm reading my notes of what Lonnie said, so very recent. Equipping the public with tools is a very important role for museums to perform. We must try to equip the public with those tools of understanding themselves and going beyond the typical role of museums. And Lonnie cited late on the example of Emmett Till and the work of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is part of the Smithsonian, which he now leads. But before, when I met him, he was in Chicago, and the idea of there being the community-led museum as well as the national museums is very strong in human rights issues. And I think I should stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. There's no doubt we have a lot of issues to dig into when we work with these human rights abuses, and museums may make a difference. Thank you so much. We are. This is the end of the opening session. From now, we really have set the tone, I think, for the conference. At 2:30, 14:30 Central European Time, we will move on to the plenary session where we will have two keynotes by Katrine Papst and Jette Sandal, answering the challenges. Now, we've heard the challenges, now we're going to answer some of them. And afterwards, a session with a panel from Liverpool. So, I would thank you so much for joining us during this opening session. And thank you so much, the viewers who have followed us online. Come back at 2:30. Welcome back to those who attended the opening session, and welcome to FIHRM Oslo 2022, to the newcomers who has arrived in person here at Eidsvoll or are joining us online. Museums under pressure, government, community, autonomy. Now in this session we are going to dive into this topic. What do we mean with museums under pressure? And we are talking in many places and for many museums about growing pressures. And it is about the autonomy of museums, the ability of museums to fulfill their tasks and follow their own agenda in service of community. We will have two major keynotes to answer the challenges we've said, to address this issue. And to moderate this session, it is a pleasure to welcome my own colleague from Eidsvoll 1814, André Larsen Avelin, who is a historian of ideas and a museologist, who has worked with us for a good 5 or 6 years now, 6 years I think. Worked a lot with co-participation in exhibition making, in collaborating with school kids and youth organizations, and in making exhibitions also. André Larsen, Avelin, is very dedicated to these issues, and it is a pleasure to leave this session to you in your capable hands.
The title of the conference, Museums Under Pressure, and we have two, no more and no less than two keynotes for this conference. Here, both of them now. We posed some questions when we started to sort of circle in the theme for this conference. One of the questions we worked with early on was, what types of relations exist between museums, governments, and other power holders? And how do such dependencies shape the role of museums and their engagement with subjects considered to be sensitive or controversial? And to address these questions, we have invited two keynote speakers, and many of you have heard about and met Jette Sandal, which is a leading figure in the international discussions on the social role of museums, globally, I would say. Unfortunately, due to certain events, she has to meet us through the screen by link from Denmark, her native country. But we will meet her nonetheless on the screen, and she will give a keynote talk soon. But first, it is my pleasure to introduce Katrin Papst, our first keynote speaker today, and she will help us chart a topology of pressures that museums might face, whether it is from within, pressures from within, or from without. And I would just say, I would introduce Katrin by saying, Katrin is a German ethnologist. She's a researcher, author, speaker, and she holds a doctoral degree in professional ethics. She is currently on leave from her position as head of the scientific department at Vest-Agder Museum in Kristiansand. And she now leads the project Identity on the Line, which is a large-scale cooperation between 7 countries, institutions in 7 countries. And it is about intergenerational transfer of trauma and the long-term consequences of war and forced migration. And not the least, she is also the chair for ICOM's International Committee on Ethical Dilemmas, the IC Ethics. So it's wonderful to have you here, Katrin. And I would just say before Katrin takes the floor, that we will have questions after the session. And for those following us on the stream, it's possible to write in questions in the small box. You'll find the box beneath the stream window. So please feel free to send in questions for Katrin or Jette when she has talked, or reflections also for discussion in the audience. Okay, Katrin, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Right now, I feel a lot of pressure, I have to say, very much pressure. We'll just say, okay, so this is the slide all the time, so I think you have to look there. I thought you might see the big one, the small one also over there. Is it possible to look at that one there as well? Okay, I think I just start. Hopefully the technique will, maybe you can have a little look until this is on, just have a look here. An overview of complex interrelations is the topic of my talk. And basically, Turleif said afterwards, or before, 10 minutes before, we stopped a meeting in the room, he said, I'm going to present solutions to you. I will not. But I will at least point out some, in my opinion, critical moments we all have to think about. So let's start. I would like to start with some sunshine pictures from my museum in southern Norway. And the point with this sunshine pictures is to make you aware that all of you, museum professionals in this room, all of us museum professionals have a choice every day to point out the difficult aspects or take the sunshine aspects, okay? Very easy to just take the easy stuff, which people would love to see, people would love to dance, they would love to eat good food. But what about the war? What about the war? What about the topics which are loaded with difficult history, which we all have somehow maybe have not addressed before? What about these topics? And the problem is the pressure on museums is, in the end, the pressure on you. The pressure on museum is the pressure on museum professionals. And the question is, are you ready? Are we ready to do so? That we have to do so, of course we have. Brilliant speeches in the opening session, and it's up to us if we can manage or not. Okay, it becomes even tougher if we work with people who have experienced difficult things, have experienced trauma, have experienced war, have experienced migration, whatever it is, people who are still alive and share their stories with us because we want to use their stories to point out to visitors, for example, what we have to be more aware of. Then it becomes more difficult. We have something like the Code of Ethics. This is the English version, the version from UK. We have the Code of Ethics. As you know, we have also a new museum definition, and the Code of Ethics is right now under revision. It will also be slightly changed, and this code should help us museum professionals make the right choices if we want to protect human rights, among others, because this is what we have to do. This is what we should do. I really hope that everyone is aware of course, museums are political. They have to be political, or at least they have to take a stand. Okay, there is no museum, this is just neutral, even if there are still some conservative voices pointing out like actually that. I want to come with 4 examples which happened all the last 6 months, and all of these examples are unfortunately just from Europe. I would have loved to mention more, but these are examples I have been got the knowledge about, I've been called about, I had some insights about, so therefore I would like to use them. The first example is from a museum in Germany, from Leipzig. It's called Grassi Museum. And the director of the museum, Leontine Meyer van Mensch, she wanted to do what we just learned in the opening session. She wanted to address decolonization or colonization. She wanted to reinvent her museum because her museum was based on stolen objects from Tanzania. She wanted to do the right thing, okay? She wanted to do the good thing, which we have to do as museum professionals today. We should do. What she did under the opening of the new museum exhibition and the new museum, she ordered, or she asked a group of artists to demolish physically under the opening, I don't know the word, I think it's stone plinth or something like that, but it was at least something where the head of the founder of the museum was placed upon for many years. The head was not there anymore. This was maybe a museum object, but the demolition of this thing was enough for museum colleagues in Germany to react heavily. Before I go into that topic, just one step back. The whole museum was founded on stolen objects from Tanzania, okay? And now, finally, the museum wanted to make up for it and want to settle the things by pointing out that the director and the founder of the museum himself was the one who had stolen the objects. Therefore, one wanted to demolish his, not everything what he did, but that he did wrong 60, 70, 80 years ago in Tanzania. She wanted to point out that thing. The problem is, when she did so, she somehow touched upon conservative voices within the museum society, if I'm allowed to say like that, and she got massive open critique from ICOM Germany, from the president herself and from the vice president, pointing out in open letters that this is a museum professional who is doing a very bad job. Okay, so museum professionals attacking other museum professionals with everything it leads to within yourself, that you are attacked by your colleagues. This is really tough, especially if you wanted to do the right thing, you wanted to do the good thing. Okay, point one in this speech: if museum professionals attack other museum professionals, that is a lot of personal pressure, not only professional pressure, also personal pressure. That's important. And changes within the museum professional are highly needed, but those who really dare to make some changes might experience that they are pressured back, okay? The museum community should support each other in a good and healthy way, and I will come back to that. So change, but do not change too much. And of course, in the end, also the question how to handle a disturbing past from a professional point of view. And the museum professionals are, of course, they do not agree always about how to do so. This was also a nice case. Some weeks ago, I was called by a museum in Lithuania, the Venclova House Museum, and they said basically to me, okay, you know, we are one of the 3 Balticum countries. Lithuania, Latvia, Estland, the 3 countries have been a part of the Soviet Union until 30, 40 years ago. Now they are separate countries, of course, but they are very much afraid of Putin invading their countries also now. So what happened? This is a museum telling the story of a writer, an intellectual, who has 50 years ago supported the Soviet Lithuania. This man, or this museum, Venclova, this is a museum about a writer called Antanas Venclova, who had been an intellectual in Soviet Lithuania, and he had lived in an apartment which today is a museum. He had a son who was an opponent, but he himself, Antanas Venclova, was among others the cultural minister in Soviet Lithuania, supporting the Soviet Union. Now we have war in Ukraine. And we have people in Lithuania who are really angry, they are afraid, and they basically demand that the museum closes down now, and they demand that there will be no more actions taken to provide the story of this family. And the museum colleagues are calling from Lithuania and say, what should we do? They want to close our museum. And when the local society wishes to close the museum, you can imagine that the local politicians who want to be elected by the local societies agree and help to support this case. Okay, I will come back to that. So the question here would be how to erase, or the questions asked, how to erase those parts of history that are or become disturbing and challenge current values. Or, in my language, if I translate it, how to act when feelings take over. And how to act, how should our colleagues in the Lithuanian museum react when now there is a chance that the museum closes down because of anger, because of fear, might be temporary, but at least it is so strong that the museum could be closed for good. Okay? Next case. From Latvia, also one of the 3 countries I mentioned. I take this very shortly because my colleague was just shocked that it was possible to happen. But what did the politicians do in this case? It was not the local society who wanted to close down a museum. It were politicians who, in very short notice, just a few weeks, made a new law, which was decided on the 22nd of June, just 4 months after the war started or the invasion started. And basically they said, we want to distance us, the politicians in Latvia said, we want to distance us from everything which has with Russia to do, and all the monuments which had been in our countries the last 60, 70, 80, 90 years, which somehow could glorify the Russian, the Soviet or Nazi regimes, have to be taken down now. 70 monuments away to one museum. It have to be care of it. The whole country wants to change their outside, their, how you call it, surface, okay? That's a problem, of course, for the museum who should take in 70 big monuments. And my colleague writes in her email, right before the parliamentary elections and during a war, one simply wants loud, easy and fast decisions. And my last example, which we are going to hear more about, is of course the war in the Ukraine. And I want to start with a museum colleague, a director of the Territory of Terror Museum in Lviv. Olga Hontjan. And Olga was responsible for a museum, which was somehow, of course, memory, place of memory, telling the stories of terror in her area. And when the war hit, she had to make changes overnight with her whole staff, which was really tough for all of them because the calls started to come from every part in Ukraine. You might know that, of course, you might have heard about it, maybe you have not heard about that, but when in the morning of the 24th of February, when museum employees in many of the museums in Ukraine got to know that the first bombs come, the invasion is affecting them, some of them left their families, they left their children, they left their husband, they went to the museum to save the objects, somehow save these objects, okay? And since then, in the last month, there have been museum employees work without any salary. They are afraid, actually, in the occupied areas that they will be taken into justice. Some of them are afraid of torture, actually, and we are talking about museum professionals like you and me. We are not talking about special people who have any kind of other experience, but they are safeguarders of a culture which is not longer wished of the Russian invaders. So what did Olga do with her team? She transformed her whole museum, and they are now a helping center for 800 museum professionals and over 114 museums in Ukraine to support museum professionals who do not longer receive any money, who maybe do not have a museum to go to anymore because, of course, we are in a war, and there we have the latest or the most extreme form of pressure of museums, total destruction, and of course the total and final violation of human rights on all levels possible. So how, I just have to go back here, how can we, in such situations, when our colleagues in Ukraine are thrown out into a war, how could we as museum professionals somehow help these people who still want to make a difference, who still go to work, who still want to do the right thing and support their colleagues? Okay, I just want to sum up a little bit. This is my beautiful museum sign. It's of course not very professional, but the one you are allowed to use for free from the pictures which are on the internet. And why are we so much under pressure? What is it with museums? What is it with museum professionals which make them so vulnerable for pressure? Of course, it is that we are the safeguarders of our joint history. Okay, everyone who wants someone to know who we are as a society, who I am as a part of the society, is interested in our joint history, and the museums are the safeguarders of this joint history. It's also personal, because if I live somewhere and this is my museum, this is my area where I grow up, it says something about me, and I better want it to be good. I don't want to come from an area which supported the German Nazi. Of course I do, because I'm German, but basically nobody wants that. Nobody wants to be a part of an area which is related to human rights abuses, so you better keep quiet, just leave it, don't talk about it. That would be a good strategy most of the stakeholders would like. So where can the pressure from museums come from? And I will go a little bit deeper into each of this, but I tried very, very roughly to make two distinctions, even if it's not possible because they go somehow into each other. But from within the museum and the museum profession, the pressure on the museum professionals can come from colleagues or employees, if you are the director, from colleagues at other museums, from other institutions, from the director himself. What if you are a museum professional who really wants to make a difference, but your director does not dare, or your director is really paid by the politicians? You don't have a chance. You don't have a chance, and I'm very sorry to say it because I believe we have to do it. But if the people who in power have power over you, you need collaborators, you need others to support you and help you, otherwise you have no chance. From the outside of the museum, individuals of the local society, strong people, very strong people, local society, some individuals, those who can cry highest, loudest, they have a lot of power, especially if the politicians listen to them because they are power positions. You have also communities, minorities, often suppressed, of course, but also sometimes, often demanding, rightly demanding to be heard in a much better way than they have before. You have the local politicians who are very much interested in being elected again. You have the national politicians who want the country to somehow be presented in a certain way. And you have the governments. We are, I don't know, I think Bård said we are lucky in Norway, there are no pressures. I don't believe it. There are pressures on museums in Norway as well, but of course to another degree, as for example, in a country and at war. And then you have the geopolitics. What do you do with people like Putin? What do you do with someone like that? No one of us, unfortunately, have the chance to change something like that. And the damage one man in the right position can do for culture, for museums, against culture, museum is immense. So the pressure on museums comes from subtle expectations, for example, from your boss, the local society, the politicians, to direct orders and no funding. This is actually in Norway also a possibility to keep the museums in track. If you do what you should do, you get the money for the projects you want. If not, you don't get the money. I'm a little bit unfair because I really believe that there are also good aspects in this policy, but there are also some downsides to physical attacks and complete destruction as we see in Russia right now. I want to take it a little bit more in a very easy way to show you where the different pressure on museum and museum professionals come from. And I also want to just point out that a museum is a physical building which you can really destroy. And you can say something about the content. Two different things, just a little apropos. So you have the museum professional and you have the museum profession. And the museum professional has, of course, the director and colleagues, which also are museum professionals, by the way. And then you have a board. And this board is often, sometimes, often actually, somehow related to the local society, okay? There are people from the local communities, local societies in the board, okay? So there you have already some kind of influence here. And then you have the local and national politicians who, of course, are very much interested in the local society and the stakeholders and often are somehow the same. This is a very easy drawing, but I hope you get the point. And then there's money involved. Money is a very strong pressure middle in some way or the other. And you have, of course, the political regimes in the different countries and the geopolitical structures in this world, okay? All these things somehow give pressure on museum and museum professionals. If I just sum this slide a little bit up, you can see the director and the colleagues. They actually can have some pressure on the museum professionals. As I said, alone, you don't have a chance. Okay, but the board can really have the director in its hands. Okay, we come back to that. Then you have the local society who really can address the board. You have the local and national politicians. There is somehow go both ways from the local society and the local national politicians because they somehow are the same people or at least interested in the same stuff, in the same things. The geopolitics and the political regimes, of course, are important for the national politicians. They also have to follow it, but they can also change it. So I forgot one the other way. And unfortunately, I would love to say the museum professional is changing the world, but unfortunately, it is not. For now, at least, the political regimes in the countries are actually doing something to our museum profession. This are the critical points, in my opinion, the local politicians and the local society and the politicians. Why do I say that? I just want to use 2 minutes. And Andre, you said there is a watch here telling me when I have to stop, but there's no watch. But anyway, I will try to keep it in the 30 minutes. There have been a study, which we will hear a little bit more about tomorrow. It was just published a few weeks ago, I think, and the 2 ICOM committees, also International Council of Museum, 2 committees were looking into the question, how is the situation in Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe today? How is the relationship between politicians, directors of the institution? We have heard and we know there is a right-wing development, unfortunately, in Europe. Nationalists are going more and more active, demanding more and more focus and changing more and more actively the museums also in Europe, in these countries. And in this report, they found out, basically, the museum sector is regulated by politics, period. They said directors are systematically implanted in prominent positions. Major differences, you can read yourself, major differences in the degree of autonomy decreasing in many countries. And André said in the introduction, I'm working with seven European countries at the moment in an international project. And during the last 3 years, 2 directors have been changed, only in this international project, okay? And the directors were related to the politicians who then were in power. So this is really interesting development. Many directors strive to be in good terms with relevant stakeholders, because the directors are also in a really difficult position. If they want to point out human rights assaults, if they want to do the right thing, they don't get money. The museum, they have to get the people, they have to let the people go. So it's not easy to be a director of a human rights museum either. So it is, do I have 4 minutes left? Thank you for the watch, okay. This was a very clear watch, thank you very much, okay. So I think I just go on with my clear watch. I want to present to you 4 quotes, which I think was really interesting. They are from the report, which also is presented tomorrow, which you find on the internet. And the first one is the following. Museums in Central and Southeast European countries are increasingly seen as leverage for reinforcing national identity and as a way to promote the country's culture abroad. Political interference is therefore more present in museums that are related to history or national identity. And one director says, I keep thinking independent, but of course I pay for it, because financially you are totally dependent on the Minister of Culture and the local government. So, because we are not following the set of rules, you are financially marginalized. I will not read this now, but I just wanted to say that also directors have really my heartfelt feelings for the position they are in. If they want to do the right thing, if they want to put the museums in a place where they really defend human rights and the politicians go in the different direction in the country, they don't have a chance, or they just have to put their values to rest. And that, I think, is devastating for people who really believe in their values. Okay, I have 3 minutes left. This is just a very small summing up, or a short summing up once more. This is tough. If your colleagues, if the people you work with closely work against you when you want to do the right thing, if you want to defend the values you believe in, and the people you work with, your colleagues, go against you publicly, this really hurts. There are not a lot of people, many museum professionals who stopped working because of this, because it's too tough, personally tough, okay? That you have a working environment which is toxic while you are trying to do the right thing. From outside the museum, I think actually the damage is not only to museum professionals, but also museum institutions, or I don't think so, but it is like that. Museums are actually, if I'm a little bit cynical, but I think I'm still telling the truth, museums are political instruments. It's so easy or so difficult like that. Those people who are in position, they can change the directors, they can change the content of the museum, they can just erase museums and they can put them up at short notice, just to provide the country with the story they want the country to be provided with. This is happening more and more, also in Europe, not to speak of other countries and other parts of the world. So I will end now. I have 1 minute and 35 seconds left to say actually that these people here, the directors, the museums, the museum professionals, these are the people who really need our support. If we want to do the right thing, if we want to defend human rights, if we want, and I believe we can, and we heard different examples in the introduction session, we can make changes, but nobody of us can do it alone. So my point is, we, as a museum profession, we have to stand together and we have to support our colleagues. We don't have to agree with every attempt they try to make a difference or make a new attempt. That can go wrong, but the discussion has to be led in a professional and good way. We don't attack each other in open letters in a very, very bad way without talking to each other somehow face to face. we don't do that. We should not do that, okay? We have somehow to support each other in our attempts to do the right thing. So when Tour Life said, I'm answering all the challenges, no, I'm not answering the challenges at all. But when it comes to people, when it comes to us museum professionals, who in the end are the people who are doing the job to defend the human rights, okay? We have to have some things in place within the institutions, within somehow the contracts between the stakeholders and us. We have somehow to try, even if it's not always will help, to safeguard professional conduct with contract guidelines, arm's length distance. We have, of course, to collaborate actively with local societies as early as possible. Talk. Tell what you are doing, why you are doing it. Explain it again and again and again. If you have to, just to let people understand what you are doing. I don't have a second left, but I have 3 more sentences. And support each other when we are trying to do the right thing and try new ways and give somehow constructive input to professional debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrin. I think we all can agree that that was a systematic and very engaged presentation and a keynote for this conference. And although Katrin couldn't provide us with the solutions to our challenges, she had some great advice there. Normally, when there are sort of open for questions, Q&As, the moderator would have prepared a question to open sort of the session. But I haven't done that, because now I really hope that one of you here in this hall, or you at streaming, watching the live stream, will pose a question or more questions for Katrin, or maybe come with a general reflection after Katrin's talk. So Torleif, he has the open mic there. And please raise your hands if you have something to say to the FIHRM Oslo 22 conference. Or to Katrin.
Oh, come on.
We have a question here in front. Torleif will give the microphone.
Hi, thank you, Katrin. I'm Janet. There are a lot of amazing pointers there. I think you hit a lot on the head in terms of the things that we're all thinking about and the challenges that many of us face. Just wondered what you thought. So on your big slide that showed all the different kind of factors in terms of influence and power, what about the media and what about social media and the impact that that can have on museums and direction and on colleagues within museums as well?
Huge. Is it still on? It's a huge, the social media, it's a huge impact actually, and the most scary outcome we see at the moment in Russia, I think, or in Russia-Ukraine problematic, because many Russian colleagues have a totally different picture of what is going on, because social media is not only social media with all the possibilities to get points out, be political, but also not to let all opinions come through, you know, so I'm not, I'm there that I want to log off of social media if I could, but unfortunately it's a word we have to relate to. So it's a huge impact. I don't have it here because it is based on people again who have a message and want to get it through. But it's huge, yeah, and scary.
Yes, we have a question over there. Great.
Yes, thank you very much for your keynote. But you know, I got a little lost about the personal history in the museums, because I see the pressure based on institutions, but how you guarantee that the personal history is on the museum too? If you understand, I mean, you say like personal history is the core of who you are. And this is my question. You just
what
pass
I mean
the
with that?
way, yes,
Yeah,
you pass
yeah.
the way, and
Yeah, I
I
understand.
feel that it's kind of exclusion there.
Exclusion in this, what I said?
In the way that the museum present
Yes, there is definitely, and I think all of us know that most of museums, at least in Europe, have the problem that they do not represent everyone and everything they should represent. So I totally agree with you, and luckily it looks like museums are going to take the shift to take all personal narratives in. That's somehow also the core of the case number 2 here, which I wanted to present. So when I said personal histories, I take my starting point that everyone at the area in a local society where they feel home should somehow be represented in their museum. This is my starting point. And that is not the case today. Okay, so I'm sorry I had to go a little bit quick over this one, but it is a time issue. You saw the time. But I think we agree on that. We can also talk more about it.
Great. Any other questions? This is your chance. Or a question over here to left.
Hi, Catherine. I got so inspired by your speech. Thank you so much. I come from Brazil, and we are facing some challenges over there because it's a little different. We are struggling against the colonization represented in the public space by the statues or some monuments and other things. There's a guy that fired up a monument, and he's facing some legal subjects. And this opened the debate on the society, who we are representing in the public space. So it's a little bit different that you presented here, because it's not to bring back our riches and things that's stolen by the colonization, but to demolish or erase of the public space this memory. So how can you help us to think about it? And the local community is very engaged to solve this problem, but the power and the political power is very conservative, as you said before. Do you?
This is a very difficult question in that regard, that even if I made some general points here, and I said, for example, the local society is very strong, that can also be very good. If it's a community and you, of course, for example, and there are many discussions that monuments are taken down from the colonial times, and that could be a very good thing. That could be a very good thing. The question, I think, is how you lead the process and who takes a decision. Is it community driven, or are these the politicians who just decided overnight without having the communities with them? So here are some differences one should discuss, and I'm not sure if you're going to hold a speech the next days. It would be very interesting, because I think many of you who will have a talk during the next days will go in details and maybe come with a totally different frame here than what I presented, and that is great, because every frame is different. So the question is, how do you come to the good solutions? I'm not sure. What are the good solutions? They're at least normally the one the communities really support, not only one or two from the local society, but communities who have been in that area for a long time, know the area, have the culture in themselves. But okay, I think it's Jette's turn.
Thank you. I will say, before I open for one more question, that Catherine will join us tomorrow as well. And for all social activities as a part of the program as well. So we'll have the chance to have a tete-a-tete with Catherine also. So I think we should move on with the program now, because we have an important keynote outstanding in the program, and that is by Jette Sandal. And she is with us from Denmark on a video link. Hello, Jette.
Hi.
Hi. Welcome to Eidsvoll through the screen. Very happy that you could be here with us. So I will give a short introduction to you, and after that I will give the screen and the floor, because you're now over the main stage of the Eidsvoll, the Wergelands house at Eidsvoll 1814. Okay. Jette Sandal has inspired many by her decades-long long work to promote empowerment, cultural participation, and social justice as key tasks for museums. She has published many articles on developments in museology and has long experience with museum work in institutions such as Museum of World Cultures in Sweden, Kulturarvsmuseet, and the national museums, the various museums in Denmark. Jette is now chair of the European Museum Forum's Board of Trustees. And Jette, your keynote is called Refusing to Look Away. So I look very much forward to hearing your keynote talk today. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I am so really disappointed to not be able to be with you in person, and what I'm presenting here is more raw, more tentative than I usually like to do it, and for once I'll be speaking without slides, which is unusual for me. And I can say that even through my privileged 3 layers of vaccination this past week with COVID-19 has been no walk in the park, as they say. Yes, I chair a museum organization that for many decades has celebrated innovation and excellence in European museums. So let me start by paying tribute to this wonderful potential of museums as societal institutions that, in uniting functions and dimensions in museums that are most often split in institutional settings, they potentially span wider and deeper than any other. Museums bring research and ideas together with material evidence and culture. They bring ideas together with physical gestaltung. They bring scientific knowledge production together with the general public. And they bring documentation together with communication. And I know no other institution that can do this. But museums are also, more than any other institution I know, self-celebratory. And I think we need to counterbalance this trend with a critical assessment of where our societies are really at and where we, as a professional community, can or could really make a difference. These are times of reckoning where we cannot presuppose or overstate our relevance or impact. We have to continuously earn and deserve them. So today, I follow a critical more than a celebratory line of thinking, trying to examine and challenge some of our basic assumptions. For me, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has served as an essential point of orientation and a navigational tool in the complex and troubled context of museums. When in the early years of this century, we were defining the ethical foundation for the Museum of World Cultures in Sweden, we realized to our surprise that no document, no statement, no platform existed in the museum field or within our museum organization ICOM for us to build on to describe the museum's social and political place in relation to our near and distant communities and to embed it in a clear set of values, a system of ethical accountability. So we ended up positioning the museum's mission, purpose, and methods in the actually quite interesting tension and ambiguity between 2 core documents, UNESCO's Our Creative Diversity and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with the absolute values of the Human Rights Declaration serving as an important counterterm to the cultural relativism and open inclusivity of our creative diversity. I still observe and revere this precise tension as I cherish the promise in the Declaration that everyone is born equal with all the economic, social, political, cultural, and civil rights that underpin a life free from want and fear. And I treasure the ambition, however impossible, of actually distinguishing right from wrong. And rereading the Declaration now for this context, I think the text is better than its reputation. While the text and its basic messages have clearly been shaped by the post-World War II context, for me, the way its interpretations and implementations are shaped by the Cold War, by imperialism, neocolonialism, and rampant capitalism is actually more problematic. The Declaration has long been criticized for its Western emphasis on the nation state, on the individual over the collective, and on rights with little understanding of obligations and duties. At this point in time, we have to dismantle the anthropocentric assumptions underlying the understanding of the global, allowing the destruction of nature to the point of its inability to regenerate. We have to shift the global north assumptions underlying the concept of the universal that allow extensive blind spots towards the profound local, national, international inequalities and wealth and opportunity. As a citizen of one of the rich countries of the global north, and as the chair of a museum organization with a focus on human rights, I'm painfully aware of this Western and global north slant or bias of emphasis and interpretation. In EMEA, I'm pretty sure the same is true for most of you. We tend to underscore the aspects of human rights that directly concern freedom of speech, political rights, and elective democracy, and pay much less attention to the aspects of social security, the right to work, an adequate standard of living, social services, medical care, education, also all included in the declaration. This downplaying of the social and economic dimension, of course, allow us in the West to focus on identifying human rights violations outside our time and place, pointing to the past of World War II and the Holocaust in Europe, but then pointing to Eastern Europe in Soviet times and to regions outside Europe and the global North. It's obviously more comfortable to focus on international and part transgressions and stand mute and look away from the obvious shortcomings, perpetrations, and violations in one's own nation or region or profession. How much easier is it in the West or North to speak about China and Myanmar? And how much more dangerous is it to speak about the clear, despite obfuscated, connection between, for instance, sponsorship of political parties and national legislation and successful candidacy of parliamentary positions? How much more dangerous is it to document rape as a war by men against women rather than as a byproduct of a national war? Or to exhibit the ethnic and racial profiling in the judicial system and of those in jail, just to give a few examples from the global North. The credibility of the human rights is obviously weakened and challenged by the most basic question of why so much unjust suffering in the world is not recognized as human rights violations. But if we have the courage to unchain it from the Western framework and uncover these biases and geopolitical double standards in the different values we ascribe to human lives, for me, the Declaration and its way of thinking remain a powerful counter-hegemonic language for protest and resistance, and a relevant and strong foundation for museums in the challenges of our specific time. As I wrote for the abstract for this talk, I used to talk a lot about hope as a driver of personal agency and a radical democracy. A few years ago, I began to add the terms fear and anger when trying to interpret the social and emotional topographies in which museums are embedded. Recently, as societies polarize and the center moves increasingly right, I have let courage slip into my vocabulary as a vital quality to ward off one's fears, to stop misdirecting one's angers, and to actually implement one's hopes. The framework of human rights is challenged and struggling at this point in time to address and deal with these alarming contemporary issues, the profound local, national, and international inequalities in wealth and opportunity, and the destruction of nature to the point of its inability to regenerate. So let me walk you through a short selection of not quite random data from my current, what I call wall of rage and shame, where hope has worn thin and the belief in progress even thinner. The gap between rich and poor nations is now expected to rise for the first time in a generation. Globally, life expectancy varies by more than a third between nations, from the highest mean of 85 to the lowest of 53. Across a US state, it can vary regionally from 91 to 62. If I crossed the bridge and changed a single digit in my zip code in Copenhagen, I could expect my life to be shorter by 7 years. The number of people forced to flee their homes has increased every year over the past decade and stands at the highest level since records began. In 2022, those displaced by war, violence, persecution passed 100 million, well over double the figure of 10 years ago. The number of refugees rose to 27 million. Most refugees were, once again, hosted by neighboring countries with few resources, and the richer countries of the global north, desensitized to the suffering of others, tighten our borders ever more, retain refugees in camps under atrocious conditions, and sit back and allow people to drown at sea. Meanwhile, since the pandemic began, the world's 10 richest men have doubled their fortunes, while over 160 million people are projected to have been pushed into abject poverty. An estimated 17 million people have died from COVID-19, a scale of loss not seen since Second World War. Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna make $1,000 profit every second, while the world's poorest countries remain largely unvaccinated. And despite receiving public funding of over 8 billion, the CEO of Pfizer described the call to share vaccine recipe as dangerous nonsense. These absurdly increasing inequalities in opportunity, power, and wealth, with their intertwined and intersecting issues of class, race, and gender, are obviously rooted in historical legacies of power and in a continued structural policy choices favoring the richest and most powerful people. So let's move to my wall of tears and rage, the destruction of nature rooted in the anthropocentrism, in human exceptionalism, in the unsustainable relationship between humans and the rest of nature. For Europe, 2022 set yet another record as the hottest summer in recorded history. Forest fires are devastating huge territories of land in both the north and the south. Arable land disappears at a rate no one anticipated of 12 million hectares per year. Biodiversity is further decreased. A single species, human, is almost wholly responsible for this extinction rate, unlike for the mass extinction event previously in geological history. Wildfires, floods, torrential rains, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, melting ice cores, all happening at a rate now faster than people predicted. Greenland's ice is melting faster than any time in the past 12,000 years, with the ice loss at a running rate more than 1 million tons a minute. And for the first time, the ice is at a melting point still in September. These are no times for denial, but yet you might walking into most museums in the world and leave again unaware of these or the scale of these impending conflicts and catastrophes. As museums, as a sector, as professionals, we need to work up the courage to refuse to look away from them. I'm not saying this is without risks or potential repercussions, but denial, I think, will in the longer perspective lead to irrelevance for the sector and for our type of institution. A colleague of mine usually says that in Denmark, and I was out of the country in this period in New Zealand and Sweden, she says that in Denmark, the 2000s were the decade when museum directors stopped speaking up on crucial societal issues, stopped speaking up against the government, became defensive and focused on securing the funding for the survival of the institution. The 2000s were the time for the first aggressive neoliberal government in Denmark, whose very first act, incidentally, was to try to close down the Center for Human Rights. And it went on then to implement the now well-known unleashing of the market, privatization, deregulation, reducing taxes on the rich. And we have, in the same period, we have begun to have a center left that is not finding it easy to present any viable alternatives to capitalism, as if all ideals of equality, egalitarianism, and solidarity have been discredited by and falling with the crumbling of the Soviet Union. This period has been called an abdication to the market by elected governments, reducing the potential power of democracy. But I wonder if there's also been a parallel abdication and retreat into safe ground for museums. And I worry, and this is something we could return to, this anticipatory self-censorship, I think is really, really interesting and worth discussing. I see and I hear omissions and absences in museums on what I consider major and obvious human rights themes. I know no major museum that has its point of departure or center axis in inequality. I know only one museum that did a special exhibition on rape, and working on major exhibition development on disability, on HIV/AIDS, on human trafficking, on colonialism and slavery, on migration and asylum seeking, or homo, bi, transsexuality in the 1990s and 1900s, I was able to find very few or no previous examples. And do I currently see any mainstream museums seriously dealing with, for instance, the overwhelming number of homeless people on the streets of Paris, or the raw brutalities of the refugee camps in Calais? Do I see anyone really documenting and showing the unfathomable suffering and cruelty to other species in contemporary society and the devastating long-term ecological costs and consequences of industrial agriculture? Protest against the museum sector's passivity or complicity with power have come on different routes with different logics and aims and have varied across the different continents and different regions. Members of the public have protested in museums against our neglect and continued support of colonial narratives and disrespectful treatment of objects. Activists have organized their own alternative guided tours in museums, and one person is known to confiscate and remove objects and then coolly anticipating his own impending arrest. Other members of the public have staged sit-ins and lie-ins to protest climate change, and the museum's continued welcome of tainted sponsorship funding. Activists have glued themselves to selected artworks to try to get people to listen and understand the seriousness of what is at stake. Some museum board members have resigned, publicly protesting their museum's continued involvement with fossil fuel funding. These protests are never without major personal costs. Good things do not happen in museums by themselves. On the contrary, powerful forces will guard the status quo and will try to oppose and resist with any means possible a critical appraisal and reinterpretation of the history and tradition of museums. Museum directors who take positive and proactive stance on these contested issues risk the wrath, not least of their own. Coloniality and decolonization, restitution, reparation, and repatriation were core issues shaping the public discourse around museums in 2021 and 22. Museum collections are mere tips of the iceberg of colonial imperialist power, but they are significant on both sides of the colonial divides as a highly tangible commemoration of a time of European glory and dominance, still clinging on for life in museums, while otherwise defeated across the globe through the colonial wars of liberation of the 20th century. For the last half-century, museums in Europe have managed largely to obstruct and stall claims for restitution and repatriation, presenting the violence and coercion in the collecting process as an exception rather than the rule, and managed to divert even the burden of proof. This passive-aggressive blocking of repatriation by major museums in the West pose, I think, a real threat to the credibility of museums as such and to the cohesion in the global museum community. And I think it's worth dwelling a little on the hegemonic methods used in this context against people in the sector who seem to be seen to be breaking rank. So this is another wall of anger. If you stand up to power, expect that they will try to marginalize you, demonize you. You will be ridiculed, belittled. You will be called by your first name, addressed as Ms., not Doctor, and given a title lower than the one you actually hold. You might be pathologized, presented as temperamental, maybe fragile and a little unstable. There will be a stigma attached to being associated with you. There will be few or no attempt to address the actual substance of your position or argument. The attack will be on a perversely trolled version of what you say and stand for. Your position or effort will be called unscientific. They will claim a moral high ground and full ownership to research and scientific inquiry. They employ the vocabulary of certainty from which you, your staff, and your work will be found lacking, insufficient, one-sided, incorrect, full of half-truths only. They will attack in packs, barking in unison. They will be in alliance with people with money and with a conservative press. They will appeal to people over you to just see reason. You will realize that the aim is character assassination and begin to fear that your job will be in jeopardy. In EMEA this year, we chose to call attention to the integrity and courage needed to be leading voices in these contested zones in the sector, knowing how painful and threatening to one's identity and peace of mind it is, how much inner turmoil, dispute, and disruption it causes to refuse to make nice, as if breaking loyalty in a family that likes to look united and in harmony. I don't know if being given the Kent Hudson Award has made the lives of the 4 recipients easier or harder. The bestowment of the award is of course symbolic and emblematic, as behind, beside, and with these 4 European individuals stand a multitude of others, not least in other continents and in the diasporic communities. Outside EMEA's area and scope has been the probably even more remarkable courage shown by not least BIPOC staff in museums, in particular in Canada and the US, breaking the silence and coming forward to expose and dismantle white supremacy, to liberate themselves and colleagues from a work environment which may claim equity and diversity, but is in reality permeated with toxic racism, sexism, heteronormativity, coming forward, demanding that boards, managers, and colleagues clean up our act. Racism and sexism are epistemic in institutions, but are always enacted and experienced personally. Current and former staff and core stakeholders have taken museums to task for the continued exclusion, discrimination, and exploitation practiced internally with staff and externally towards partners. Monuments and trustees, directors, curators have fallen from the pedestals these past years after 2020. In museums, as in life in general, the process of decolonization has been perceived almost solely as the need and responsibility of the colonized. And to the methods of silencing and suppression, which I talked about a minute ago, in this context, there is an important addition, that of claiming innocence of the suffering of the victim, a basic technique by those in power to exonerate themselves, ourselves, from responsibility. I have little patience for this contrived innocence at this point in time. We need to create spaces for dialogue where dominance is kept at bay, where listening is deep, and where statements are not contradicted, where emotions are not disparaged. And interestingly, this line of invoking empathy opens directly into solidarity, solidarity as a 20th century political concept, which had almost been made extinct, and which again, in its turn, leads to the immense but almost completely forgotten and repressed potential of collective power. Connecting with and staying persistently with the troubles, with the unsolved dilemmas and unsolved conflicts, combined with an equally unflinching solidarity and trust in our collective power, is what I think we as humans and as a species need to bring into this next period, while simultaneously working our way out of centuries of human exceptionalism, human supremacy, and its devastating ecological costs and irreparable losses. Will our framework be able to stretch? Will our empathy and solidarity extend? Will our professional courage expand to a fuller context of an interconnected social justice and climate justice, to an equitable decolonial system of values and a multi-species planetary ethics? Can we as a sector comprehend and connect with the implications when different systems of thought merge and create new moral and judicial contracts, as for instance, the legal personhood obtained by the Wanganui River in New Zealand and the constitutional rights acknowledging Pachamama in the Ecuadorian constitution? I leave these questions open. In the gardening world, they say that to plant trees is to give body and life to one's dreams of a better world. It's an act of faith, of hope, investing in a future that oneself will not be alive to see and be part of. So I try to propagate my hope. From my COVID sickbed and other desperate times, I wait for the hope I planted last year. Adding to those 14 trees this June, and I know this is not the best month for planting, but so be it, I planted 27 major pieces of hope, 11 evergreen, 6 apple trees, 3 cherries, 3 plums, 6 pears. And in case these major hopes should fail completely, I plant scores of minor ones, modest perennials, and I sow loads of tiny seeds of annuals for the quick results, making sure that from every angle, every path I take, every window I look out of, I look into a field of replenishing hope. Thank you.
Jette, I'm sure I have the entire audience here when I thank you for this very strong and committed keynote. When we got your, just have to say this, when we got your abstract, I read it, and it was a very so essayistic abstract, and I was thinking, this is the best abstract I ever read, because it was, you know, committed and strong, the message, and I think you very much conveyed that today to all of us. So thank you so much for that keynote. And I believe Jette also sort of posed many questions to us, but also perhaps even a challenge, and that was the word courage. To use courage. Do you have the courage, in a way? That was sort of a part of what I interpreted your message to be. Do institutions sort of cultivate that individual that have courage, or do they not? And that's sort of a main question also for this theme for the conference, Museums Under Pressure. We have to look within our institutions as well, and within ourselves, to find perhaps that courage and to cultivate it. I would like to open the floor for questions. I hope there are some questions for Jette. She will be with us on video link for a few more minutes. So Torleif is ready with the microphone. Any questions or reflections? While we wait for one, we can at least say that there are people thanking Jette for such an interesting lecture, following us live. That was great. Let's have one question. Perhaps, Katrin, would you like to sort of return to the stage? The two keynote holders might perhaps meet. One on the screen and one in the...
I don't know if you can see me yet, but I can see you at least.
Yeah, I see you too.
Thank you very, very much for this speech. I would love to see it in written form because it was really brilliant. I have a question to you. I was watching your face while you were talking. And I am wondering, what is your main driving force? Are you angry? Are you sad? Are you? You said already, hope is not longer the word. The kind I would interpret it as a kind approach of just hoping is no longer enough. So what is your main driving force in your work? Because as you talked about, there are so many fields which are critical to address now. So what is your main driving force?
I think maybe the emotion you read, other than the COVID, is our doubt. And I think one of the big questions that I have been looking at, and that is not, that is partly been looking at all this repatriation stuff, going back to the whole story of the Icelandic sagas being returned. And I was part of the big repatriation of 35,000 objects from Denmark to Greenland to the new National Museum. So looking at all this then and now, I sort of began to doubt one of these underlying premises that I think we have, which is that museums are more progressive than the societies around us. And that's a very big doubt for someone like me to get at this point in life, because we tend to think we are the progressive ones and the restrictions come on us from the outside world. And that, I think, is something that we need to begin to think about. Certainly in my case, working city government, the opposite was the case. The city was way ahead of the museum. I think working national government, you work with something slower and more conservative. In some cases, I think we have to be really, really self-critical, particularly around this repatriation stuff on all different levels. And then there's another thing that I was thinking about that I hadn't thought about before speaking, because I'm not sure that question was asked of me, what is the action, what to do? And I really think this line from empathy to solidarity to collective action is a viable one, and one that we need to resuscitate. We need to put life back into these terms in the current environment. And I was thinking about it, there's a lot of talk at the moment that museums need to become varmstuben, I don't know what that word would be in English, places where people can come and remain warm in the winter because the heating bills will be so big they can't afford them. Yes, and that's all very good. But I also think we need to begin to address some sort of collective action. And I remember a sign that was there in the very hard time of austerity in the UK, which was psychologists marking in the streets saying psychologists against austerity. And we know as psychologists that austerity is really, really dangerous for people's mental health. So I think these lines of collective action is something that we need to discuss much, much more. Was that a reply?
It was a reply, thank you very much. And if I can just come with a very, very last only reflection to everything you are saying, it's a human perspective I hear you talking about. It's a human support. It's support for each other. It's supporting the values we believe in. And I myself have to say very honestly that I was disappointed by the ICOM community, by the museum profession I deeply, deeply care about, and I really think has an important role to play and has to play for solidarity among the museum professionals. I think it's on a better road now. It's on the way now. But unfortunately, there was not so much support to get the last years than it could have been. But this is just my personal opinion. And I know you're also ICOM deeply involved there.
Yes. I think we will move on with the program. Jette, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm very happy that we could finally meet you and see you here in Oslo and Norway. So thank you. Applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, this concludes the first plenary session of FIHRM Oslo 2022. But there are more to come. Today there will be a panel discussion here led by National Museums Liverpool and Leicester University, a representative from Leicester University as well. So return to the stream, those following the stream, in about 15 minutes, and we will start anew there. And yes, thank you for this first session. Hope to see you in the returning sessions. There are 7 more sessions, so please return tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. But first, panel soon. Thank you.
Conservative museums, self-congratulatory museums who are in reality satisfied by doing things as they have done. National Museums Liverpool is not one of those museums. When we had our call for papers, National Museums Liverpool, they sent us a whole session with 4 panelists and lots of stuff. And it is about how to move forwards. How do we do things? How have we done them? How do we do things? How do we go about with our relations with the public, with government in new and changing situations? I think that is what you're going to talk about. We'll find out. National Museums Liverpool is where FIHRM started in 2010. And to moderate this session, we have Laura Pye, Director of National Museums Liverpool, who has worked there since 2018. And she has a background of broad and extensive museum experience from around UK before that. I will not take up more of your time. So Laura Pye, please welcome Laura Pye and the rest of the panel that you're going to introduce.
Thank you. So, thank you. Hello, everybody. Have we got our presentation up here? It's up here. Yes, I'm being told it is. Marvellous. There we go. Super. So as I said, I'm Laura. I'm the director at National Museums Liverpool. I'm joined today by 2 colleagues from National Museums Liverpool and a colleague from Leicester who will introduce themselves as they come up to speak so that you know which one of them is who. And we are talking about co-production, and we're going to talk about some work we've done. So National Museums Liverpool is a group of 7 museums in the UK. We are what's called an arm's length body of government. So we're part of we're nationally funded. We're part of a national government funding scheme. And so we have a board and we have politicians and we have a whole range of stakeholders. And being based in Liverpool, we have a whole load of community members who are also very active and very keen to tell us how they think we should be doing things in Liverpool. And so we have to work alongside all of those people as well, balancing lots of competing demands. And so my colleagues are going to talk you through some projects we've got going on at the moment. If I go forward a slide, this one. Oh, there we go. This is a picture of Liverpool. If any of you have ever been, this is our waterfront. My colleagues are going to talk about some projects we've done in the past where we've worked with different partners and different communities to co-produce different exhibitions, different events and different things. And then talk more specifically about a new project that we're embarking on at the moment, which is about us taking that co-production element to a brand new level so that it's much more involved in everything we do as an organisation. So the first colleague I'm going to welcome up is Janet Dugdale, who's going to give a bit of an introduction into where we are with our thinking and some work we've done in the past. So Janet.
Thank you, Laura. So just wanted to start with thinking about us as an organisation, as National Museums Liverpool, and the work that we have done and are doing now around co-production. So for us, our development of co-production very much comes from our values, and it's aligned to everything that we do, and it's really underpinned by our brand. So there's a little bit here, it's an extract from some work we've done recently on our strategic plan. So we aim to be curious and imaginative, brave, approachable, responsible and essential. And I think probably there are some things in there that we question ourselves over, challenge ourselves over, but hopefully there's some things in there that speak to the first 2 keynotes that we've heard already this afternoon. And as an organisation, in terms of our values, we pride ourselves on being welcoming, honest, educational, and as a team, we're trustworthy, respectful and inclusive. So this session is really about the work that we're doing and the work that we started over the last 18 months to develop a framework for the whole of National Museums Liverpool around co-production. And it's very much relevant to all of our 6 strategic objectives, and perhaps one that's really important here is one that is a focus on being more representative. So we embarked on, about 2.5, 3 years ago, we embarked on a whole programme, what you might call a really big plan. So a 10-year plan to develop our waterfront in Liverpool. So it's our waterfront transformation project. And really it's a whole series of projects that's going to take us quite a while to deliver. But at the heart of it, we wanted to do it with our communities, with our stakeholders. And the work that we're doing is to really develop all of the museums on the waterfront. But our cornerstone and our starting point is the International Slavery Museum that Lonnie Bunch mentioned earlier today. So the work that we're doing in our transformation project will give the museum its own front door. It will completely transform the museum. It will be the first place that you come to in terms of our whole waterfront. And it will give the museum more space and more identity to tell the really important stories and narrative and work that it needs. And it also responds to a real massive demand from our communities around working with us and having a place for their story and their voice. We're also going to retell and reimagine our Maritime Museum. At the moment, both museums are in one building. In the future, they're going to share 2 buildings. We're also going to use a number of our dockside buildings and reimagine them as new spaces for cultural and other types of activity and commercial activity as well. And we're also enhancing and doing a little bit of change to our Museum of Liverpool, which only opened just over 10 years ago in 2011. And some of that will be completed first, which will allow us the time to develop the International Slavery Museum and Maritime Museum. And this image shows that whole site, and right in the heart of it is a dock, a graving docks, which is called Canning Dock. It was built in the 1760s when Liverpool had a massive role in the transatlantic slave trade, and we want to reimagine that space and use it as a place that connects all the narratives of those 3 museums. So being about the city, being about a place of the sea and all those connections right across the world, but absolutely and honestly and openly telling new narratives around transatlantic slavery and how that really connects all of our history in Liverpool and how that connects us nationally and internationally. And one of the things that we thought about when we started to develop this project was that we wanted to do more than we've done in the past in terms of co-production. And my next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've done in the past and some of our learning from them. But we wanted to develop a framework around co-production because we needed a guiding tool. We've talked already this afternoon about being courageous, how we support each other as colleagues, how we support each other through change, how we work with activists outside our organisation and inside our organisation. So we felt that to be able to do the work we wanted to do, we needed a really strong foundation. We needed some strong building blocks. And through the work that we've done to develop a framework, we're also acknowledging there are really unequal power relations, both inside and outside organisations like museums, that often only a small section of society actually visits our museums, and even smaller number of people actually get to create them. And through the work that we're doing, through this project to create a framework for co-production, we're acknowledging that our structures and our priorities and our processes and practices have not only worked to maintain a power imbalance, but continue to perpetuate wider inequalities in societies. So where museums are on that whole thing that we've already spoken about this afternoon, are we at the forefront? Are we lagging behind? Are we a microcosm of society? Where are we in all of that? And where do we want to be and where can we be? And what is our hope? And we know that we've got a lot of work to do to really evolve into the kind of museum organisation that we really want to be, but we're building on some really strong foundations. And I think that really helps us to think about and understand power and equity, and also to frame how we can retain some autonomy as well. And that's a really interesting place to be with, Laura sort of set out how we operate both in a political and funding landscape, but then how does that fit with us as museum colleagues, our museums, all of our communities, all the people who want more from us all the time. And I think when we think about where museums are and where we are under pressure, there are a lot more people making more demands, louder demands and really clear demands of what they want from museums. And I think that what we've been struggling with, I suppose, and challenging ourselves with, is really thinking about how we can create something that enables that autonomy, but at the same time enables us to be permeable and to be positive, and also to be adaptive and to be connected as well. So how do we do something that enables us still to be very permeable and open? This is not an example of lots of projects that we have done, and it's just a snapshot really. It doesn't reflect all of our museums and galleries over time. It's just a few things that I picked out, really to talk about the long journey that we've been on in co-creating and co-producing, and how we work and how we develop projects and ideas. So there's a really important word here, and for us and for me, that's about how. How we do our work really matters. So by being curious as an organisation, by really seeking collaborations and developing relationships, by co-producing, we can try to enable museums to remain relevant to contemporary society. So the little snapshot here, just going to take you through them all fairly quickly. So up on the top left-hand side, we've got people at a memorial service for the sinking of the Lusitania. So it was a ship that sunk in 1915, and every year people come together around one of the propellers for a service. And when we were developing a new gallery, we actually thought, well, let's have a conversation with them. So we invited everyone to stay behind and have a conversation about how they could be involved. So that idea about people who wanted to tell a story of ancestors, of their families, and the trauma that they've been through, and that had been lived through many generations, to be part of how we developed a new gallery. So they worked with us on Lusitania, life, loss and legacy, and now that's an ongoing relationship. Next along is a piece of work we did to create an exhibition, but it was also the whole programme. We worked with an organisation called Wicked Fish, who it's organised and run by young people with learning difficulties. So this was their exhibition. They wanted to really think about how language has changed both in the past and today. But they did everything around that project and that exhibition. They did the engagement programme, they did the public programme, they did all the press and media. Over on the right, Galkoffs and The Secret Life of Pembroke Place. This was a Jewish butchers, kosher butchers you can see outside in the community. There was, well actually what's happened is that the building was probably going to be demolished. And so there was a whole conversation about what to do with the tiles from the frontage of this building. So should they go into the School of Tropical Medicine? Should they be in another university place? Should they be in a public monument? Or should they be in the museum? And people came to us and said, we really want the museum to have it. So we set up a really big stakeholder group, very much involved Liverpool's Jewish community, and really listened to descendants of the family as well, and together everyone made a decision about what they wanted to happen, and what they wanted was for it to be in the museum. So we developed a whole project around that as well. So it was very much a collective, collaborative decision. I'm going to skip round one to April Ashley. April was born in Liverpool in 1935. We did a whole big project with an organisation called Homotopia and with April, so 3 partners. Homotopia, small arts organisation, April Ashley, single trans woman, and us as National Museums Liverpool. So really important exhibition and a whole programme that developed around it, including an important conference in 2013 called the Unstraight Museum. But we learned a lot around how we worked and how people viewed us as well. Just skipping back, there's just a little Twitter image there. So we did some work over the last 2.5, 3 years. So 2 pieces of work. One of them was to create a new display about our Benin collection in World Museum, Benin and Liverpool. And we worked with a number of people from people of African descent in Liverpool who wanted to be part of that story. They'd criticised the museum in the past for how we hadn't told a full story. And they were very much part of how we've told the story about that collection, how it came to be in Liverpool. They've shaped that whole display, and it launched in March of this year. But alongside that, we did another piece of work, which was to develop our returns and repatriation policy. It's a 2-page policy statement on our website. It was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my career, because it was really hard to get everyone to agree on what we could do, what we could say. And it was an enormous piece of work that involved lots of conversations, but it ends up with 2 pages. And sometimes I think things that are quite small can be really significant, but we very much co-produced it. Lots and lots of different people's voices were part of how we developed that project. And then over in this corner as well is an image from Slavery Remembrance Day, which is something that we've held since 1999 in Liverpool. Lonnie referred to speaking at the first one, but we co-produce that event every year with our communities and sometimes with the City Council. And it's a big piece of work for 2 or 3 days of programming, but again, really significant and a lot of listening. And the point of just sharing those is actually we've learnt a lot from doing this work over the years. And it's really over many years, and it's really led us to this moment. I suppose some of the really key things that we've learnt are around power, about the power that we have and the power that perhaps other people don't have, but also how slow we can be as an organisation to move. We've learnt about scale, smaller organisations, individuals, how that interacts with bigger organisations. We've understood a lot more about ourselves as an organisation, on organisational complexity, and how hard that can be for people to navigate. We've learnt about unequal relationships. We've learnt about how to think about how we'd even confront and talk about hard subjects within the context of society and within the context of a society that has become even more polarised. We've also learnt a lot about the impact on colleagues and partners of doing this type of work, that emotional labour, and we had a session in FIHRM 2020 online around that, and there is so much more work to do around that. So what we've done is to think about how we can take that learning and how we can respond to the feedback from our communities and from our colleagues and move on, actually. So I think quite often there's a tendency for these type of activities to remain linked to a project or linked to particular relationships or linked to particular teams within an organisation. And we're really challenging ourselves to scale up our work and really understanding the value of both lived and learned experience. And so what we've been doing is over the last 18 months, we started working with the University of Leicester, the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries, and we're going to hear from Cecile in a few minutes. As we started to develop our projects around the International Slavery Museum, and you can see here some visual minutes from a visioning session from July 2018, when we were working with our Respect group, who are a group of people who support us, who run Black-led organisations in the city. And we thought about what this museum could be. And very, very clearly, it was an evolution of all the things that that museum has been in the past. We're on a really big journey, but we knew we needed to take it to the next space. But to do that, we had to think about how we were going to do it as well as an organisation. And so one of the things we did when we put in a big funding bid to the National Lottery Heritage Fund for the project, which we've embarked on now, and we were successful with the funding last year, Igniting Ideas and Action, was to develop a framework for co-production for the whole organisation, and we would test it through the International Slavery Museum. So that's what we're doing at the moment. And we've done a lot of work with colleagues in the organisation, and we're doing a lot of work at the moment to test the draft definition. So what we've said at the moment is that co-production is democratic in intent. Co-production is about reconfiguring established power relationships, challenging inequality, and working together to improve society. It is when individuals and groups influence public services from conception right through to governance and delivery and evaluation. It demands that we build equitable and reciprocal relationships and that we generate mutual benefits. Co-production brings together different forms of experience and knowledge, both lived and learnt, to generate better outcomes and mutual support. So my next two colleagues are going to speak more about the project and how it's developed, how we've developed the framework so far and where we're going with this, and we can welcome your input into all of that as well. But it is a moment in time, and for us, hopefully it will give us some of the hope that Jetta was talking about how we can do things differently. Cecile is now going to come and speak. Cecile's Research Associate in the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries in Leicester, and it's been fantastic to work with her and her colleagues there to bring real academic rigour and theorising to how we bring everything together.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Janet. So my name is Cecile, and I work for the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries at the University of Leicester. And our brief was to create a co-production framework for National Museums Liverpool that is anchored in the context of Liverpool, in all of the expertise that Janet has shared that is already within the organisation, within its language, its future planning, and all of its ambitions, which is tested and developed through the International Slavery Project. So this process should result in a located and in a useful framework for National Museums Liverpool, and also support the team working on the International Slavery Museum and the Waterfront Transformation Project. So the development of the framework takes place over about 18 months and in 3 phases. So phase 1 was all about exploring what a framework should actually look like. As a starting point, we thought it needs to be a thinking tool, a very accessible top-level document, or a framing device which sets out the purpose of the process, the roles and expectations of everyone involved, and also the challenges or the actions that underpin each stage of the process. So co-production frameworks are quite difficult to find in museums, actually. So we've had to look across other sectors, including healthcare, for example. So we developed 2 different working papers and a workshop with NML staff to start a process together of learning with everyone involved in the project. So that included ourselves as researchers on co-production, while we also gathered data on what a framework should look like for NML staff. So phase 1 also established a project structure through the core research group, which is a group of people from across National Museums Liverpool who would start working at pace to develop a shared understanding of the project's aims, to refine the action research process, and also to start drawing on all of this to develop a draft co-production framework. So phase 2, the middle one, which we're currently in, is where the majority of the action research takes place. So this phase involves this ongoing process of testing the draft co-production framework within National Museums Liverpool, and to start thinking with colleagues as they undertake co-production. So together with staff working across 5 different test places, we generate data while also using the framework in a very focused way on a day-to-day basis to explore how it's useful, what's missing, what kind of tools they need to make it work. And we do this by asking staff to gather their own reflections on the process, observing the sessions they organize with communities, and by following up to see how the framework supported relationships with co-producers. So at the very end of this phase, we will have refined the framework even more and captured organizational learning through this process. We're also producing a toolkit which will accompany the framework and which will share some of the tools that National Museums Liverpool staff are already using and some of the ones that they might need to embed the co-production framework. By June 2023, all the learning from phase 2 will help the core research group to produce a version of the framework that is very accessible. So we're thinking about the formats and how we actually share it as well. And that reflects what co-production should look like and feel like at National Museums Liverpool. And we can then start phase 3, where we're going to test the framework and share it more widely and talk to our key stakeholders about whether it works or not. So we're gathering data as we go through the testing. All of the learning goes through the core research group, and they take responsibility for refining the framework. So the project was always designed to have the International Slavery Museum and the Waterfront Transformation Project at its very core. But to create a framework that is representative of National Museums Liverpool, we need to work with teams across National Museums Liverpool and harness the huge amount of already existing expertise in all of those places. So we've got 5 testing places, as you can see: the International Slavery Museum, Canning Dock and the Waterfront, NML Wide, which gives an opportunity to anyone interesting or wanting to work with co-production to feed back to us, the art galleries and a collection project they're doing, as well as the marketing team. So in addition to the definition that Janet has shared earlier, the framework contains these 13 principles, and they're all drawn from NML expertise and also from some of the existing scholarship around co-production. So there's probably too many of them, but at the same time, we're also finding that there's not quite enough yet. So the point is that they exist in tension with each other. So you can think about being visible and making co-production work that you're doing visible, but that sits in tension with protection, of course. So these are the kinds of things that we're testing out working out where colleagues need most support, and that is helping us define what tools we need to develop for the toolkit. So the testing places within ISM are all very focused, as you can see here, on how the framework can support the work that they're already doing and what needs to be in place for it to work. So one strand is looking at selected view of the principles included in the draft framework, so protect, visible, mutual, and capabilities, to ask what it means to enact these principles ethically and fully. How do we protect and care for the well-being of our partners and also our colleagues? When and how do we make such complex work and experiences visible? And how must the sharing of our framework be informed by our principle to protect? What does it really mean to acknowledge and strengthen the capabilities of our partners in this work? And how do we understand and enact mutual benefit in ways that are significant and also meaningful? So other testing places like the NML-Y test are much broader. So this test asks how the framework builds on previous co-production experience within NML and how it might be tested and embedded for all staff to engage in the framework. And then we've got test place 5, for example, which involves NML's marketing, communications, digital, and design teams, and which is really key in finding a format that speaks to people internally as well as externally. So how do we actually communicate all of this? Asking how we talk about co-production and how we might co-produce marketing outputs as well. So at the end of the process, we will put together, we'll have together produced a co-production framework that helps staff across National Museums Liverpool to work with and support colleagues who do co-production. But the process of reflecting on practice and opening up space for thinking has been an important outcome in itself. So colleagues are taking the opportunity to reflect and to share their findings with each other. And the RCMG team, so myself and my colleagues, we come together, we chat around it together with colleagues, and when they get to the framework, there's a lot of learning coming out. So this opening up of space for reflection is very easily lost in a large capital development project. And colleagues hadn't really anticipated the value of thinking, of having a place to think and step out of the project to reflect on all the learning. So Dr. Remily Jayawarda is going to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks very much, Cecile. Yes, as Cecile said, my name is Dr. Ranmali Jayawardena, and I am the Community Participation Lead for National Museum Liverpool's Waterfront Transformation Project. For this final part of our presentation, I will exemplify how the work discussed so far is being imagined into action through my test strand of the draft co-production framework around strategic planning. So, how can co-production inform a large capital project? How can it be approached to both deliver the specific learning and understanding required for the project, meet the project timetable, and support the organisation move towards working with co-production partners in equitable and meaningful ways? I'm working with Leicester's Research Centre for Museums and Galleries to explore the draft co-production framework in relation to the strategic planning of the co-production of the Waterfront Transformation Project, asking how truly transformative co-production can be progressed as part of and inform in significant ways a major capital project. Is it possible to meet all the principles that have been outlined in the framework? Where is compromise needed? And is it possible to work in ways which are both good for the project and which advance the organisation's ambition to place co-production at its core? To test these questions, the Research Centre and I have recently begun meeting fortnightly for 2 hours. During the first hour, I work on strategy and planning. Cecile and her colleague Suzanne then join me for the second hour to explore progress, questions, and the relationship between the planning and the framework. The focus of my strategic planning so far has been creating a schedule for National Museums Liverpool teams and design teams to be engaging with communities in our current phase of delivery, which runs until June 2023. To forecast the volume of engagement we need for each team to meaningfully co-produce their work and to adequately resource this, I produced this table to visually represent sites, teams, and potential activity. So along the top, you'll see individual sites in the Waterfront Transformation Project, plus an additional column at the end representing the all-site work. Underneath these column headings, you'll see the teams co-producing an area of work for this site. Based on initial briefings, I'm working to the premise that each site team needs a minimum of 6 community workshops to deliver the work outlined for this current phase of project. Each box with a team name, therefore, represents 6 workshops. There are 29 boxes or areas of work represented in this table, so that's 29 times 6 workshops. And that equals 174 community workshops to be hosted between now and next June. Of course, there'll be variation in this. More teams will undoubtedly be added, while some teams may choose to combine and run workshops together. Workshops will also vary in size and intensity, spanning from 5 to 150 partners. Despite this variation, the volume of engagement required for a co-produced project of this scale is vast. Up to this point, my community participation team, of which there are 4 of us, have been devising and delivering most of the project's community workshops. We're now at the point where both principally and logistically, the understanding, practice, and ownership of co-production must be shared across teams. So how can the draft co-production framework help with this? I frequently use the principles to share our ethos and to shape practice, but the issue of scheduling is essentially a maths problem. Does the framework have the resources to help with this too? I revisited the draft co-production framework with this question in mind and was drawn to this diagram representing the co-production process. I'd previously read it as a method of internal teams working with external partners. Now, however, I began to see it as a way of working concentrically between colleagues too. So looking at each stage, building relationships, the community participation team have led on this so far, but how can we support other teams take ownership of developing on these relationships? By sharing our progress to date and drawing on their subject expertise, we can work with National Museum's Liverpool teams and design teams to identify specific networks they need to plug into to develop their work. In terms of mutual benefit, these teams are then well placed to develop these relationships as they can more accurately identify what they will need from community partners to develop their work, as well as the skills, resource, and support they can offer in return. Planned together, beginning to work independently and collaboratively with their partners, teams can take ownership of those relationships and the process of working together too. Evaluate with partners. This sense of ownership can then be strengthened when teams explore the extent to which collaboration meaningfully impacts their partner's relationship to the museum, its collection and narratives, and the team's own understanding of the work they do and the objects they steward. Reflect and refine. Returning to the community participation team for focused support, site teams can then design their next phase of work based on what has been achieved in the first. Working in this concentric way between internal and external partners, we can build organizational capacity to co-produce across teams whilst moving towards our capital project deadlines. The strategy enables each team to take ownership of their 6 workshops and drive the conversations they need to develop their work successfully. It means long-lasting relationships become more possible as they are spread across several teams rather than concentrated and managed by one. It also allows partners to get to know individual members of staff and get closer to the detail of the project, increasing their investment in the transformation. Essentially, this way of working translates timetables and deadlines into conversations and relationships. There is more to be done. Project staff within teams need to be identified. The frequency with which each external partner engages with us needs to be considered, as well as our ratio of local, national, and international partners. But all of this is to be worked through as Cecile, Suzanne, and I continue to test this framework in the months ahead. For now, applying the co-production framework to strategic planning has made it possible for us to imagine ways of working which are both good for the project and which advance the organisation's ambitions to place genuine co-production at its core. Thank you.
Come up. Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. My colleagues are going to join us on stage. So does anybody have any questions that anybody wants to ask? I'm just going to start with one, if that's okay, because Robbie, I think you picked on this a bit in your bit. The importance of co-production being everybody's job and right throughout the team. Do you just want to talk a bit about how you've discovered that works with back of house, what we would refer to, so the finance team, the HR team, the health and safety team, because I think it could be presumed that those teams, they didn't feature on your chart, but they are quite integral, aren't they? Do you want to just talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that we have sort of really addressed in the last couple of weeks and months in terms of the test phases that we'd have initially envisioned for the framework. A lot of them were that public-facing, that sort of display-led, exhibition-led, community-led sort of test sites. And what we realised was actually for us to just hold the co-production method in those areas was superficial. It was tokenistic, because the work that we were doing, if it wasn't translating into back of house, no matter how much good intention there was by staff delivering, whether it was a co-produced exhibition or a co-produced workshop, there was always still going to be that delay as soon as, we had to work with colleagues who were working with internal processes and systems and policy that on a day-to-day basis, sort of those external facing member of staff might not have that much influence over. And so to get that buy-in, to really make sure that co-production is embedded as part of the work that we do at National Museums Liverpool, we realised that we need to take everyone along on this journey with us. These principles can't just be for what we talk about to community members. It can't just be us coming to conferences and talking about this wonderful ethos that we as staff team have, but how can we share that with our colleagues as well? And we're at the beginning of that test site, and we've identified colleagues to test the framework in finance and business resource as well. But I think what's really interesting is that as soon as you approach a member of staff with not just what you need done, but why you need it done, why we're working in this way, and why we're being, we're asking actually, is there a more streamlined way that we can be paying community participants? Is there a more streamlined way that we can explain what a new supplier form is? All of those things, it really gets that buy-in from colleagues across the board, because they all want to be working as well to be upholding and to sort of really transform the work they do at National Museums Liverpool. But it's just that aligning of ethos and principle with practice and policy.
Thank you. Any questions from anyone in the room or online? I think if you type it online, I'll be able to see it. I'm not totally sure. We'll give that a try in case. I'll bring you a mic over. I'll run.
Hi, thank you for sharing. It's an astonishing experience, and I really want to know what was the criteria to choose who are able to participate as community in this co-production, and which are the criteria to choose the architect and the design team, something like this.
Absolutely. I mean, do you want to?
Well, you start with. I mean, I can talk about the design team but I mean, in terms of the design teams, the design teams was part of our co-production process. So members of our community sat on the panel to appoint both our architects and our designers, and they were generally community members that have worked with us before, so in that case it came from our Respect group as a kind of starting place where it then spread out from. My procurement team found that really, really difficult because I don't know what it's like in other countries, but we're spending public money. There's certain rules on how you procure. It's quite difficult to involve a community partner in that. It was a very long and very difficult process, but it was very successful. And so that started off with our Respect group members, and then in terms of the widening that circle out, Ramli, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, in terms of I presume you mean partners as in who are actually, we're bringing in to talk about, well, what does it actually look like? What does the new International Slavery Museum do? What does it feel like? In that way, we start with what we know. We start with our existing relationships, and we think about who have we worked with, who do we have relationships with at the moment, who did we used to have relationships that that we don't have anymore, and why? What is that state of play at the moment? And we use that as sort of like a community mapping tool to understand what the landscape of engagement is at the moment, and then we research. Well, actually, what areas aren't we hitting at the moment? And we have sort of four sort of roundels of space that we investigate. So we've got the very, very hyper local community in Liverpool who live in sort of a region called L8. Who are very much the heart of what we do, and a lot of people that Laura mentioned who are in Respect work in organisation in that area. And then we want to make sure that we're not just focusing on our immediate neighbours, but we understand that Liverpool has a really wide demographic, and so we look further into making sure that we're engaging with communities, organisations, hosting conversations in that wider Liverpool City region as well. And then obviously we have partners we want to work with nationally. There's amazing work being done across the sector. So, plugging into those, that area of expertise and finding out who people have worked with and, who we can sort of build relationships with in Liverpool. And then obviously we are the International Slavery Museum. So what is that global impact, and how can we tell that story of not just Liverpool and Britain, but Liverpool and the world, and how we shaped the world through our involvement in transatlantic slavery and economy? And so that's very much an ongoing process. I don't think that there's ever going to be a point where we go like, we got everyone, like we can close the door on that now. But I think that's I think the importance and why it's so crucial to work with teams across National Museums Liverpool, because within a team of 4 community participation, we have that, I suppose, like nuance and understanding of, well, how can we read the demographics in the room? How can we identify who's missing? But, there'll be expertise across every single team that we have of like, well, actually, we're not talking to this community of seafarers, or, the sort of the personal and professional relationships that people have across teams really help us build that capacity to understand not just who is in the room at the moment, but who we need to bring into the room to really make sure that this co-production project is as successful as it can be.
Thank you. I know we're over time. We're 3 minutes over. I apologise. But we are around for the rest of the conference. So if anyone's got any other questions about our project or about how we're doing it, feel free to come and ask us at any point. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Laura, Janet, Ramli, Cecil. This was so impressive, I must say. And this was, this was about, should be also about power. This was powerful in a very positive sense. Our Norwegian National Museum Network, Democracy Network, is very many of our members are very focused on the topic of co-production, and this was sort of a manual of the broad and inclusive and really complex version of it, and how it's possible to go about doing it on such a scale. That's it really it's as I said, really impressive, and I think many of us will go back and see over again this session. And by the way, it's available online for everyone until the 26th of September. Everything is out. and you may go back and see it again if you missed out on something. But this was answering the challenges, really. We've had a lot about the problems, the counterforces, why it's really, how much is on stake and how difficult it is, and that's important to talk about. But this was really inspiring in the way of how you go head into the matter and in order to improve what we're doing. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll be back at the Nobel Peace Center at 9:30, the first session. And then we may come in earlier, but the session will start at 9:30, the first session there. And we wish everyone, hopefully everyone will come back tomorrow to follow the new sessions we'll have then. Thank you so much for today. This was the last session. This was really, we have a whole conference already, I think, and it's much more to come. Thank you so much.